Premises are hard to see, and that is just fine with me. Modus ponens is the plan. Serve you logic, I am.
The converted man here.
When you talk to people today, many people believe that science is at war with the Bible. Hasn't science disproved God?
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you're going to say that the answer is no. But I'm also going to say the answer is no, because as God is usually, typically, majorityly defined, is supernatural. So since science can only study the natural, it can't study God. It can't comment on God. It has nothing to say about God. And it could never find God even if God was absolutely real. And it could never test God even if God was right there in front of it for it to do so, because it is not a natural thing.
So hasn't science disproved God? The short answer here is no. In fact, almost all scientists will concede that there is no evidence that undermines the idea of God.
Wow, that's an extraordinary claim, and I'm totally sure that you have mounds of scientific papers that have been published by scientists past and present that all say, well, there's just no evidence against God. I'm going to sign that paper that says, yeah, I agree with that statement. Well, there's not a single scientist that I could find that would say that there's evidence against God. Surely you have mounds and mounds of data to prove that point. Oh, no, you don't. That's hyperbole. That's not even hyperbole. It's not true. It's this thing that, this statement that you've made. What the? I've got a phone call. Hold on. Yeah. Oh my. Oh, I forgot about you. Ow, my ears. What do you? Oh, you're outright. I don't want to talk to you. Wait. What? Did you know? Oh, bleep. Alternate facts are my favorite sort of facts. I'm not surprised by that. You know what is surprising? What? This. Anyways. So, it's an outright lie. It's not true that scientists have said this. Maybe what you should have said is that God is unfalsifiable. Thus, there would be no way to disprove it in science, because God is a thing that you would have in science. In order for God to be a scientific hypothesis and then theory, you would have to have some sort of way to disprove that God exists, which theists won't give you that, because that's dangerous. That's risky to give you that. So one example you could say is, well, there's a prophecy in the Old Testament about the city of Babylon, and that nobody will live there after it's been destroyed the last time it was destroyed. And so if anyone lived there from generation to generation, then that prophecy would be false, and that then, therefore, there's no God. If that was the case, if you could get a theist to say this, then you would have some way to falsify God's existence. Now, you get into problems here because, well, what is that prophecy saying? Is it saying that I have to live there and have a kid, generation, and then that kid has to have a kid, generation to generation? So, in total, there are 3 generations. Is it many generations? How long do I have to live there? And is one family enough, or do we need multiple? See, the prophecy is vague. As a matter of fact, during the war, the Gulf War, and Saddam Hussein was trying to rebuild Babylon. And this was something of big interest to many apologetics and theologians, because if he succeeds, then that prophecy is null and void. Then we have some problems. Of course, they're not going to admit that it means there's no God. They're just going to say that one prophecy is wrong. Although that then therefore should cast doubt on the other prophecies. But nonetheless, he was even putting, supposedly, I had read at one point, his name on the bricks that were going to be used to build Babylon, because that was part of the prophecy as well, according to somebody at some point or whatever. And so if he succeeds in doing this, it means something special, and it also nullifies the prophecy. Well, during this, there were people living in tents around the area that was, to survey it, to start building there, to start cleaning the rubble. Now, once Saddam Hussein got captured and killed and was out of power, this whole thing, that was the end of that, and it just became a tourist site. And so that's maybe the end of the story, but we've got many, many years from this point forward for that location to gain a settlement. And my question, though, is, didn't the prophecy already get falsified? Somebody was living in a tent in that city. Doesn't that already nullify the prophecy? Well, it wasn't generation to generation, see? So there's always a way to move the goalpost around in that, so it's not something that you could falsify. Okay. What about that Jesus says to the disciples, anything you ask for in my name will be given to you? Well, okay, Jesus, can you please put $1 million right next to me right now? Well, that didn't happen. So, therefore, I have falsified God. I have found a test, I performed the test, and God did not deliver on the expected result of the test, therefore there's no God. But theists won't give you that. William Lane Craig also gave an answer to the question of, well, what would it take to show you that you're wrong, to convince you that you're wrong? And he said, find the body of Jesus. If you can find the body of Jesus, that would falsify Christianity. Now, it still wouldn't falsify God, so somebody could just be like, well, you found the body of Jesus, I guess I'll be a Jew now, or even a Muslim, but it wouldn't falsify God, but it would falsify Christianity. So it's not really an answer. But Craig can kick back knowing that no one is going to be able to do that, not because Jesus didn't die and stay dead, but because there's no way to identify his bones after all this time, and even if we were close to the time he died, there probably still wouldn't be a way to identify who it was. Okay, well, this guy's got, holes through his wrists, and he was crucified, and we can tell from the way his bones are that he's been stabbed in the side. Well, it could still be any schmuck. It doesn't necessarily have to be Jesus. We don't have his DNA on file. So how would we prove that it's Jesus? And then, of course, if Jesus never existed, well, then you can't find the bones of Jesus. So you have an unfalsifiable claim answered by, well, do this thing that's completely impossible for you to do, and then that would falsify it, and that's a dishonest approach. So God is not falsifiable, and unless and until this guy or somebody says, okay, look, do this thing, and whatever that is a reasonable thing that can be done, and that if this is the predicted result that should happen, and if it doesn't happen, that means there's no God. Until somebody does that, there'd be no way for there to be evidence against God in the sense that he's using those words here. Because God is unfalsifiable, which makes it non-scientific, which makes your question be nonsensical.
At best, atheists can say science has found no evidence for God, but even if this were true, it would not come close to ruling out the possibility of God.
Saying that is like saying that science hasn't discounted the possibility of the Loch Ness Monster, even though it kind of has. Or the possibility of Bigfoot, even though it kind of already has. So let's go a little bit more metaphysical, a little bit more into the realm of fantasy. It hasn't discounted the Fae folk, which we would know as fairies, or leprechauns. Hasn't discounted them. And see, the Fae folk are very clever. and so they know how to hide from science. And so we have yet to capture one because they're very quick, and they're very nimble, and they're very clever. So there's no way to disprove this idea, nor is there a way to discount this idea, because the idea is unfalsifiable. It is not scientific in the first place, so science can't even comment on it. Are there fairies? No. Why? Because we have no evidence that there are. Oh, well, but that's not really science, is it? Okay, here. Make a explanation that is testable about what fairies are, and how in the world you know about them in the first place. And then make a hypothesis that, if disproven, would disprove that fairies exist. Once you've done that, then you have some sort of science to work on. It is not the burden of the one saying that there's no fairies to go and show that there's no fairies. It's the burden of the one saying that there are fairies to show that there are fairies. The burden is still on you.
It is also possible to bury God with science if we can explain everything on a naturalistic basis. This would essentially bury God with science. Dr. David Berlinski, a philosopher and physicist who is skeptical of the existence of God, believes that science has not buried God. He responded to the God delusion by Richard Dawkins by writing The Devil's Delusion. This is what he said in the flap of that book.
Well, whatever he has to say is completely and utterly irrelevant, because your argument should stand or fail on its own merits, not what one person in whatever field has something to say on this particular topic, which may or may not be quote mined and or cherry picked. And honestly, I don't care what somebody said. I don't care about Dawkins. I don't care about this schmuck. I don't care. It doesn't matter. What's your argument? Your argument, as is saying that, well, if we find a natural explanation for everything, then science has buried God. That's not true. That's not true for a number of reasons. First of all, it's an appeal to ignorance to say, well, I don't understand this phenomenon, therefore God. So that's one problem. Secondly, even if we had a naturalistic explanation for everything, you can always move the goalpost and say, well, but yes, all of that is explained by God. You can always go the presuppositional route, which I hate, and I want to burn to death with fire, of saying, well, you can't even have science or logic or reason unless there's a God, because you have no foundation for these ideas. Ha 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 ha. Well, that doesn't work, but that's your submission, so there's always a way to move the goalpost back. Unless you nail down what the bleep God is, and how science would go about finding it, or falsifying it, then it doesn't matter who says what, because what matters is the evidence for it, not the evidence against it, which, by the way, again, we can't have, because there's no way to falsify it, because you can always move the goalpost, because you're not willing, or perhaps able, to nail down, no pun intended, the concept of God. Nailed down, because, Jesus nailed down. Well, he was nailed up, I guess, so, yeah. What's the difference between a painting of Jesus and Jesus? It only takes one nail to hang up a painting. Okay, back to the video.
Has anyone provided proof of God's inexistence? Not even close. Does quantum cosmology explain the emergence of the universe or why it is here? Not even close. Have our sciences explained why our universe seems to be fine-tuned to allow for the existence of light? Not even close. Are physicists and biologists willing to believe in anything so long as it is not religious thought? Close enough. Has rationalism and moral thought provided us with an understanding of what is good, what is right, and what is moral? Not close enough. Has secularism in the terrible 20th century been a force for good? Not even close to being close. Is there a narrow and oppressive orthodoxy in the sciences? Close enough. Does anything in the sciences or their philosophy justify the claim that religious belief is irrational? Not even in the ballpark. Is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. Dr. Craig, in a debate with Peter Atkins, explains that science cannot explain logical and mathematical truths because science presupposes them. To try to prove them using science would be circular reasoning. Metaphysical truths cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical, moral, and aesthetical judgments cannot be determined by science. There is no way science can determine that what the Nazi scientists did in Auschwitz was wrong. Most importantly, science itself cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is filled with unprovable assumptions that must be correct in order for science to be conducted.
Yeah, exactly what I said, except I sped up this whole bit because you're quoting this guy that I don't care about, and then going off on your own little tangent. he doesn't really sound like a scientist anymore to me. He sounds an awful lot like an apologist, and I'm having trouble believing that he's really an atheist at this point. But I don't care if the guy is or isn't. He's wrong. He's wrong fundamentally because what the definition of your particular God is would not fit in the category of scientific endeavor in the first place. So, simply put, you're doing bad theology. You're not just doing bad logic and bad science, but you're doing bad theology. And you know what it says about false prophets in the Bible? Well, guess what? You're one of them now. Oops. Kind of a problem for you. Not for me. I don't care.
Next, I will discuss several of the arguments that are posited to disprove the existence of God. The central proof for atheism is that there is no proof for God. This, however, is completely false.
Proof in what sense, though? Because what you're going to potentially offer would be arguments, which aren't proof. An argument, if you had a sound and coherent one, which you don't, but if you did, would not be proof of anything, period. All it would do is compel the listener that cares about logic and understands logic to investigate the conclusion further. Because we don't know if the conclusion is true, we just know that it's logically sound to think that the conclusion is true, thus propelling us to investigate it. On the flip side, if you have a logically incoherent argument, as you do, we should be skeptical of your conclusion, which means we doubt it, which means we don't have to investigate it further. We might, because we're bored, but we don't have to. There's nothing compelling us to spend our time or energy to investigate your claim further. Now, if you mean proof like some sort of repeatable test that we could do, then you might have something. If you mean proof like empirical evidence, like direct observed example of God, that's empirical evidence. So, show me God. Let me see God. If you don't have that, then what the bleep could you possibly have?
Relatively recently, a huge discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community, specifically because it seemed to suggest a creator. That discovery was the fact that the universe had a beginning.
No. No, that's not a thing. At all. Period. Question mark, exclamation point. No! You don't, no! What are you talking, no! Let me guess, you're gonna go off into the Kalam cosmological argument now, right? No, look. The Big Bang is not about there being a beginning of the universe. And if that's what you really think, then you just don't understand what the Big Bang model is. And you're like, oh, well, here's this chart. See, and then there's this, like, white edge on the far left. And before that is nothing. So, see, that far white edge, that must be the beginning. And you might say that because you don't know what the bleep you're talking about. No. No, no. No, no, no. And no to this wrong idea that keeps being propagated and forwarded by apologists over and over again. We don't know if there is a beginning. We can't say that because the math breaks down on that white fuzzy edge that looks awful like a beginning, but it's not a beginning. We don't know what it is. Our physics and math and everything that we understand breaks down at this point, the Planck point sometimes called, and we can't go before that. Or if there is even a before that to go to. If time no longer exists, then the idea and concept of before is out the window. So there is no before. There's only that now moment. And that's really hard for us to wrap our brains around because our brains have evolved to this point to understand localized phenomenon. And this is very different than anything else that we've ever experienced, period. So it's not a simple thing, oh, well, there's a beginning to it. And even if there was a beginning, that wouldn't mean God done it.
The Kalam cosmological argument states,
The rest of his video is nothing but the Kalam cosmological argument, and I'm going to be dealing with that in a different video in far more depth than I would be able to do now. The only thing I want to comment on right now is where he says, well, of course God doesn't have a cause or something that made it. That's just silly, and the whole sort of rhetoric that we've come to expect from apologists regarding that. And what it seems like they just don't understand is why that objection is being made in the first place. So there's different versions and flavors of the Kalam, and it's evolved and changed its wording over time to try to avoid some of the errors that it brings into its own argument. So, for example, it might have said at one point, everything that exists has a cause. Well, that's a problem because God's supposed to be a thing that exists, so we can't say it like that. So everything that has a reason for its existence, well, that's not very good either because they're we don't like that. So finally it came to the point that it is today. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Oh, see, then God never began to exist, so it doesn't need a cause. So asking what caused God is incoherent. Ha 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 ha. Well, but it still makes God a special pleading fallacy when you do that. If God is the exception to the rule, that is special pleading. And so the attempt at logic that you've done here in saying that everything else has a beginning and everything else has a cause, but not this thing, is nothing more than special pleading. And apologists continue to fumble with not understanding why somebody would ask, well, what caused or what made God? And the reason is because we're trying to get you to be consistent with your attempts at doing logic. But your attempts at doing logic already contain within this particular argument the logical fallacy of special pleading built in to try to avoid the later cause of special pleading that's going to happen. We'll just say that God doesn't need to come into existence. We'll just say that God has always existed, and we'll just maintain that without any proof of that. Other than, well, if that's not the case, then the argument doesn't work, and the argument does work, but it doesn't work, and so no. Alright, we don't have a logically coherent argument. We have zero evidence. That's what we mean when we say proof. We mean empirical, direct evidence. The Kalam is not that. Arguments are not evidence. Arguments are not proof. We don't have a logically coherent argument. So even if he did offer us that, at least we could go from there, but he doesn't even do that because it's the same old boring apologetics that we've heard. But I am enjoying dismantling every video that he has, and I'll continue to do so until I'm sick and tired of it. I'll see you next time. Actually, you'll see me. You'll see whatever I put on the screen. Whatever. If you like my stuff, please, for the love of humanity, donate on Patreon to me once a month. It can be any amount. Even $1 helps me continue to exist. And then I'll say your name at the end of the video like I'm going to any moment now. Here I go. Robert W. Lester, Joseph Schmidt, Hector Defendi, Luis Castro, Jacob Santos. Make it hard for me to do this list by becoming another person that throws money at me, or don't and be a jerk. Yeah, there's appeal to consequence. Haha.